The man charged in Tupac Shakur's murder is speaking out from behind bars for the first time. Dwayne "Keefe D. Davis insists he was 300 miles away when the rapper was shot.
For more than 28 years, the murder of Tupac Shakur remained one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in music history. A case filled with rumors, gang politics, and endless theories, but the real truth never fully came out. But recently, the Las Vegas Metro Police have discovered a buried container near a property connected to Tupac's final days. And what they found inside was not money, jewelry, or weapons. It was something far more disturbing. Private audio recordings of Tupac, journals filled with fear and warnings, hidden financial records, and details so shocking they challenged everything investigators knew about this case. So what exactly was hidden inside that buried container? And what did it reveal about Tupac's final days that remained hidden for nearly 3 decades? Let's dive in. 28 years later, September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas. At around 11:15 at night, at a red light near East Flamingo Road, a black BMW comes to a stop. Inside are Tupac Shakur and Suge Knight. They have just left the MGM Grand after a boxing event. Suge Knight is driving. Tupac is in the passenger seat. Music still in the background. After a moment, a white Cadillac pulls up on the right side. Too close for a random stop. It sits there for a moment at the light, almost matching their position. No one thinks much of it at first, until the silence turns into movement. Shots are fired. Not one, 13 rounds hit in seconds. Inside the BMW, there's barely time to understand what's happening. Tupac is hit in the chest, arm, and thigh. The impact is immediate and brutal. Suge Knight, who is also hit with bullet fragments and shattered glass, reacts instantly. He speeds up the car and rushes forward, trying to get out of the danger zone and reach the hospital as fast as possible. Within seconds, horns start blaring on the road. People turn their heads in confusion, and some step out of their cars trying to understand what just happened. But by then, the Cadillac is already gone, disappearing into traffic like it was never there. At the University Medical Center in Las Vegas, doctors take over immediately. Tupac is still alive, but in critical condition. His right lung is removed in an attempt to save his life. But the internal damage is too severe. 6 days later, on September 13th, 1996, he dies. Now, after the death of Tupac, everyone thought it would not stay complicated for long. But even after 28 years, no one was ever fully convicted in a way that closed the entire story. Witness accounts never fully matched, and every time investigators moved closer to answers, something shifted again that pulled the case back into uncertainty. Then, in 2023, the case moved again. Dwayne "Keith" Davis was arrested and charged in connection with the investigation. He was a former gang associate linked through statements and claims tied to the night of the shooting. It was the first major legal step in decades, but even that did not bring closure. Instead, it reopened pressure on the same unanswered questions that had existed since 1996. And during that reinvestigation, police found something unexpected that changed the direction of the case entirely. It came during a routine inspection tied to a property in Nevada, in the greater Las Vegas area, a property where Tupac Shakur had allegedly spent parts of his final days. While reviewing the area, investigators noticed something unusual beneath the ground. A small section of soil did not match the surrounding surface. Slightly disturbed, but not enough to stand out at first glance. A controlled dig was started at that exact spot. It was taken in immediately and sent away for private handling. But later, When the details came out, it shocked everyone inside the investigation. Because inside that container, they found secrets kept hidden by Tupac himself that changed everything we thought we knew about that night. Final 8 months. When investigators finally opened the buried container, inside were dozens of cassette tapes, handwritten journals, folded letters, the final 8 months before Tupac Shakur was killed. The tapes were not polished recordings meant for the public. Many sounded personal, almost like private thoughts recorded in moments when nobody else was around. But it was the journals that raised the most concern. Several pages reportedly mentioned repeated sightings of the same vehicles near recording studios, hotels, and temporary houses. Black SUVs. Men standing near entrances who did not seem connected to security. Some notes were short and rushed. Others were detailed enough to sound almost like surveillance logs. One page described him refusing to enter a building until security checked the area twice. Another mentioned changing routes suddenly after noticing the same car earlier in the day. There were also repeated references to never moving alone anymore, and when investigators compared those writings to documented events from 1996, the pattern became harder to ignore. By mid-1996, Tupac had reportedly surrounded himself with heavy security almost everywhere he went. People close to him later described how he had become increasingly alert in public places, constantly watching crowds, exits. One detail appeared again and again inside the journals: the vest. Several entries allegedly mentioned discomfort from wearing body armor during the extreme summer heat in California and Nevada. The writings suggested he still wore it regularly because he believed danger around him was becoming more serious, which made one detail from the night of September 7th even more disturbing. That night in Las Vegas, he reportedly decided not to wear the vest. According to people around him, Tupac felt safe that night traveling with Suge Knight and members connected to the mob Piru Circle. It was reportedly one of the few times during that period that he decided not to wear the bulletproof vest, mainly because of the extreme Las Vegas heat. The fear inside him did not feel sudden. It sounded like someone who had been living under pressure for months, watching danger slowly move closer around him. Investigators also found another kind of writing entirely, much more personal. And for the first time, it revealed a dangerous battle Tupac had been fighting during the final months before his death. Inside Death Row. By the time Tupac had fully stepped into Death Row Records, it looked like success from the outside. But inside, the structure worked very differently. The label was controlled by Suge Knight, and people inside the system often described it less like a music company and more like a tightly controlled operation. Security was not just protection, it was control. Inside that system, Tupac was not moving freely the way most artists do. After his release from prison in 1995, his $1.4 million bail was covered through Death Row, and the way the finances were handled made it even more complicated. But they were not treated as personal assets. They were recorded as recoupable costs. In simple terms, everything he used had to be earned back through future profit. So even with massive success, including millions in record sales, the money he actually received in hand was far smaller than the public would expect. And this created something more important than money: dependency. Even basic decisions, travel, schedules, studio time, even his legal representation was tied into the same network. Later financial reviews of the label showed deeper issues. Shell companies, complex cash routing, and internal accounting made it hard to clearly track where all revenue was going. Now, by mid-1996, it felt like something was changing. Reports and internal notes suggested Tupac had begun questioning his financial situation more seriously. For the first time, there were signs he was trying to understand what was actually happening behind the structure around him. But even within all this, one thing stands out in hindsight. Despite heavy spending on security and logistics for travel and daily operations, certain protective and administrative safeguards were not fully aligned during key moments in Las Vegas around September 1996. Because beyond control, beyond money, and beyond contracts, investigators found signs that Tupac had been secretly planning to escape everything around him. The escape theory. By mid-1996, Tupac's actions started to look less random and more planned. Investigators later found signs that he was trying to build distance from Suge Knight and the system around him, especially when it came to money. In the summer of 1996, he began pushing for more cash in hand, often requesting advances under production or personal needs. But instead of keeping money in accounts tied to death row, he was reportedly holding larger amounts in cash himself. At the same time, another pattern started to appear. Outside the United States, he moved differently. In Europe, especially Italy, he experienced a kind of freedom that was missing in Los Angeles and Las Vegas. That trip stayed on his mind, and inside those journals, investigators found signs that he was already thinking about building a second base overseas. Not as a fantasy, but as a possible exit route. Around this same period, the Machiavelli idea was expanding beyond music. It was being shaped like a separate identity, almost a long-term plan for independence. A company linked to his mother, Tupac Shakur. It was designed to handle film projects. When investigators later reviewed these moves together, a pattern began to form. Legal and business structures being quietly shifted into different hands. Each step, on its own, looked small, but together, they pointed in one direction. He reportedly had less than $150,000 in accessible personal funds, despite generating massive revenue. On paper, he was still tied to debt and recoupment structures that kept him financially dependent on the label. But after his death, everything changed almost instantly. The value of his music catalog and unreleased material began to rise sharply. It led to long legal battles over who owned it and who had rights to it. When investigators later reviewed the full scope of his creative output, they realized something unusual. The amount of material he left behind in those final months was not just output. It looked like something being built under pressure, something meant to outlive everything else. The hidden creative empire. By the time investigators looked deeper into the estate, the scale of what Tupac Shakur had left behind became hard to ignore. Inside the vault were more than 152 completely unreleased songs, along with hundreds of hours of raw vocals, demo takes, and unfinished verses. The speed was unusual, too. Studio engineers noted he could finish full tracks in under 30 minutes, often in a single take, moving quickly from one idea to the next without slowing down. But music was only part of it, and plans for community projects. Some pages were structured like blueprints for youth centers and creative spaces. A shift toward acting, directing, and social work through initiatives like A Better Place. One of the most important projects mentioned in the archive was One Nation, a nearly completed collaboration effort that brought together artists from different coasts, including members of Boot Camp Clique. The goal was simple but bold, to push back against the growing East Coast versus West Coast conflict that was shaping hip-hop at the time. At the same time, the financial reality around his death told a very different story. When he died, he reportedly had very little liquid money left, while his estate was immediately pulled into legal conflict. including major claims from death row records. On one side, there were debts and lawsuits. On the other hand, there was a vault of content that had not yet been fully understood. That is where his mother, Tupac Shakur, stepped in. Eventually, she succeeded, transferring full control of the archive into her own company, Amaru Entertainment. And what followed was something no one expected at the time. Posthumous albums began to be released one after another, turning into global commercial success. Projects like Are You Still Down? And Until the End of Time sold millions worldwide. But while all of this was happening in the background, something else was still unresolved. And that is where the contradiction becomes painful to see. But his murder case kept fading into fragments, with no clear closure, no final answer, and no one fully held responsible. Then, in 2023, something finally happened that looked, on the surface, like long-awaited justice had arrived. But when you look closely, it seems like just another attempt to control the story and keep the truth hidden. The case reopens. In July 2023, something happened that reopened the case after nearly 28 years. Duane Keith Davis was taken into custody after years of public interviews, in which he described his alleged role in the killing of Tupac Shakur. For years, he had spoken freely, almost treating it like a story he controlled. But investigators later used those same public statements as the foundation of their case. In September 2023, he was officially indicted for open murder. The man was linked to the white Cadillac. But once the legal process began to tighten, the story started to change. Inside the jail, Davis began changing his position. He later claimed that much of what he had previously said was not true. He also presented a new defense. He claimed he only placed himself in those stories for attention and financial gain. Then came another major claim. He stated he was not even in Las Vegas on the night of September 7, 1996. Instead, he said he was roughly 300 miles away in Los Angeles, and that is where the case begins to crack again. Because the state does not have the strongest forms of physical proof, no direct forensic chain that independently confirms every detail of the narrative. What remains is a case built heavily around statements that are now being questioned by the same person who gave them. Not a clean conclusion, but a case that still resists final truth. And if you take a closer look, it brings back that old uncomfortable question again. And that is where the buried container begin to matter in a very different way. Because they show a version of Tupac that was never fully visible to the world. Tupac's double life. For 28 years, the world only knew one version of Tupac Shakur, the untouchable performer. A man who looked fearless in front of cameras, always standing in the middle of conflict, always louder than the world around him. Inside his private journals and recordings, investigators found a very different reality. A man who read deeply, who wrote constantly, who was quietly planning to leave violence behind. He was not just powerful in hip-hop, he was dominating it at only 25. But at the same time, everything around him, contracts, money, security, even decisions, kept him tied inside a system he could not fully step out of. And that contrast is what still haunts his legacy today. Because the more investigators studied what he left behind, the more it became clear. He was living two different lives at the same time. One the world saw, and one that was carefully kept away from it. And that is the real realization. We never truly knew the full Tupac, and the truth that was being controlled on the surface was sitting inside that buried container for nearly 3 decades. Now, for the first time, we are only beginning to see a small part of the world he was actually living in. So how do you see Tupac now, after knowing this hidden side of his life that was never fully revealed before? And as he once said, "Fear is stronger than love." Do you think that shaped everything around his life and death? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss more incredible truth-exposing videos like this, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.